My name is Esther Lezra, and I am an assistant professor in the Global and International Studies program at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I grew up in Spain and Venezuela, so it was quite easy for me to develop methodologies and objects of study that were international because I manage three languages fluently and also can research in several others besides those. My present research focuses on Cuban and Guadeloupean and Spanish discourses of nationalism, and also images of monstrosity within those discourses. What I do is I look at beginning in the late 18th century and 19th century. I have been looking at historical texts, colonial historical documents, very much influenced by the method of the subaltern studies group. In their subaltern methods of historiography, in which they uncover or listen for, in the dominant text, they listen for anxieties and erasures. And often they do that through specific tropes. And I have followed the trope of the monster in colonial documentations of Guadeloupean uprisings, Haitian uprisings, and most exciting has been to me has been to read the Spanish documentation of what was going on the French side of Haiti during the uprisings, and the way that they describe the rebellious blacks. And the heinous acts of violence that occur on the other side of the island. And there are specific words that return. And it is interesting to see how these words, over maybe a period of 20 years, acquire a historical, objective, authoritative voice when they are simply just narrative devices at the beginning. And over a period of time, you can see how they acquire ideological, institutional clout. In my research, I find patterns of similarity in the way that disenfranchised populations in the 18th and 19th century were represented back then, and the ways that disenfranchised populations are represented now. And not to say that the political and historical context are exactly the same, because we need to keep always in mind that the stakes in different historical moments are very different. However, there are similarities in the ways that certain populations of people are still demonized with particular narrative tropes. For example, the trope of the monster, the trope of the demon, the trope of evil. These are tropes that are being reproduced now vis-a-vis Afghanistan, Iraq, the Taliban, Osama bin Laden, and the forces of evil that we need to protect ourselves against, internationally as well as within the nation in the U.S. So this is why a study of rhetoric, and representation, because I also work with visual representation, is very, very pertinent. I find that the visual representations and the visual tropes used to describe the horrors of torture that happened in Iraq, in Abu Ghraib, are reproduce some of the narrative tropes and image tropes that were used in the 18th century to create a sense of the monstrosity of the colonies, or the monstrosity of the slave populations in the colonies, or the monstrosity of the Haitian Revolution. We are in a moment where we are risking reproducing historical violences that certain narratives of globalization attempt to erase. Therefore, to use subalternist methods to read dominant narratives of globalization is very, very useful at the present moment, in order to be as vigilant as we can of the risks of reproducing these past violences. So it is not just a question of what people and objects we study, but also how we study them, and an awareness that I think in global studies we need to have, that, and we already do have, that globalization has meant very different things to different people around the world, depending on the resources that they have, depending on what access they have to the global economy, to global citizenship. These are all very, very weighted terms, and they do not mean the same to everybody. But I'm interested in the way that these other societies, marginal societies or peripheral societies, adapt global culture to their own needs. So it's not just a study of how global culture is imposed on people, but also how people can make it work for their interests, which is very often not the same interest that the dominant global culture that says you must develop in this way, you must spend our money in this way, or the money that we lend you in this way. It's not necessarily the same that the local people need. Well, I think that there's an understanding in some theories of globalization that that a global civil society is attached to some kind of capitalist class, or a class of people who travel, who have access to mobility. And this, I would say, would be the dominant narrative of success, the success of globalization. Now, under that, or in the corners of that, or erased from that narrative, is the narrative of, well, what are the populations of people that make that possible, who don't have access to mobility in the same way, but for whom, for example, mobility is something imposed because they lose their job and have to go somewhere else to find a job in another maquiladora, for example. So those would be the narratives that I think that dominant narratives of globalization that would like to see it in a positive light, as something that is necessarily beneficial to everybody. I think that those other stories are many more, actually, than the story of globalization and its successes. And I think that it is important to see those stories of violence and famine and forced migration that are within the narrative of successful globalization, in order for us to be able to find ways to make what is happening, because there is no doubt that the global is happening, but we have to find a way to make it so that there is less human injustice involved in the process of what I think has been hundreds of years long process of capitalist expansion, colonial expansion. And as you know, globalization from many perspectives is or has been seen as a continuation of colonialized colonial institutions and colonial economies.